titled Curriculum Approaches to Achieve Relevant Competencies. We had 5 scheduled speakers. Unfortunately, Daniel Abrahamson has not shown up. So we have 4 speakers. Our first speaker is Sophie Hill. Sophie graduated from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow in 1993. After working in clinical practice for a number of years, she moved into education in 1998, teaching at the prosthetic and orthotic course at Salford University. Her PhD explored the difficulties in studying prosthetics and orthotics from the perspective of both students and staff and identified some potential threshold concepts in prosthetics. Sophie currently works in Oslo at the Oslo and Akershus University College in Norway. That's been since 2010. Sophie?
Thank you for the opportunity to present here at Gen meeting. This is part of my PhD, and as Dan said, I wanted to look at why students were having difficulty with things. We used to have these conversations in the corridor, and we go, why are they muddling up the quasi-hydrostatics weight-bearing aspect of ISROS with the suspension aspect of ISROS? We would have these conversations about several different things. Why are they doing this? They would do it year on year on year. And so I wanted to look at that. I also wanted to look at with students with very many different backgrounds. My research is based on from the universities in the UK, and certainly at Salford we had students from a wide range of backgrounds. We had students who came straight from school at age 18, 19. We had students who were mature students. That's in the UK, the class is over 21. But some of them, I think the oldest student I had was 50. They came with different qualifications. Some of them had degrees, some of them just had school certificates. So there was this huge variation. Why did they do? What was causing these difficulties that they had? Okay, so what I wanted to look at in my thesis was what they experience as difficult, potentially threshold. I'll come on to what is threshold a little later. Why are they having these difficulties? How can we explore these? Can we do something about these difficulties? Or is it just understanding those difficulties that will then help us get them through those difficulties? And was there variation in what the students perceived as difficult? So some of the theories I looked at, one was called troublesome knowledge, the other was threshold concepts, and the method I used for my analysis was interpretive phenomenological analysis. I'll explain a little bit about all 3 of these. So troublesome knowledge was first described by Perkins in 1990. David Perkins works at Harvard in their education faculty, and he comes from a social constructivism perspective, and that means that you have to recreate knowledge. Learning is through recreating knowledge. It's not the chalk and talk method, it's that you give students things to do that will then enable them to recreate that knowledge, to learn it anew. He came up with this idea, again, he was looking at what was difficult. He came up with this term of troublesome knowledge. So troublesome knowledge is something that for some reason the students are finding difficult to get through. He described 5 different types. It could be alien. It's foreign to them. It's from a different perspective from theirs. It's conceptually difficult. It may be the opposite to what you think it should be, or it may be that you have to put several different pieces of information together. It's inert, perhaps. It's information that you have in your brain, in your memory, but you don't necessarily, you don't use it all the time. An example often used for this is information in Trivial Pursuit. Who wants to be a millionaire? That's the type of information that helps you answer those questions. Ritual knowledge. Ritual knowledge is something like historical dates, or there's the example in arithmetic with fractions. If you want to divide a fraction, you don't divide one fraction by another. You take the second fraction, turn it upside down, and multiply it by the first. That's the rule. You follow the rule. You don't necessarily understand why you follow the rule. You follow the ritual. And then there's tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is things that are hard to explain. And we have a lot of tacit knowledge in P&O. And then later on, Glynis Cousin added the idea of emotional capital. And that connects a little bit to what Deborah was talking about this morning. Learning is emotional. And for some things, the students might not be emotionally ready to learn something. So it might be an age thing. It might just be that it resonates too much with them. And it's very difficult for them to understand that. Threshold concepts. This is the house I grew up in. My parents no longer live there. That's true. A threshold concept is explained as a doorway, a gate, a way into something. The door opens, you pass through it, it shuts behind you. The way you perceive the world, a concept, changes. It's different from what it was before. It's gained a lot of interest in the past. It was first developed in 2003. This year, in a couple of weeks' time, is the 5th conference on threshold concepts. It's gained a lot of interest because it allows lecturers to focus on what's important for their subject. Rather than generic educational development, it focuses specifically on your subject. I think that's what I was going to say. So, we open the door, we go through, it shuts behind us. Once the door has shut, it's hard to see back through to the other side. You've become an expert in that subject. And that ties back up again to what Deborah was saying, is that remember what it's like to be a novice. Sometimes it's hard to think back to that. Sometimes things that are obvious to you, you don't realise why it's difficult for the students. I'm going to use an analogy of a house now. We've gone through the door, the front door, and we enter a hallway. And we're in that hallway. We're in that little space. We're not through the final doorway into the, having gone through the threshold concept. We're in a hallway. We're in a waiting area. That waiting area, in threshold concepts terms, is called liminal space. And the term liminality comes from social anthropology. And a good example of it is being a teenager. As a teenager, you're not a child, you're not an adult. You're in that betwixt and between stage. You're neither one nor the other. So, in our terms, the students, they haven't yet grasped this concept. They might show examples of what's called mimicry. Deborah described this as the pretend to know game. So they might give you examples of, they seem to know it, but you dig a bit deeper and actually they don't. Or they might fluctuate one way to the other. Sometimes they get it, sometimes they don't. And then, within this concept of liminality, Mayer and Land also described what it was like. What does it look like? How do you approach this liminal space? That's the preliminal aspect of it. How does it come into view? Liminal is when you're in that space. And then post-liminal is when you exit the space. How do you exit it? Does everybody exit it in the same space? Possibly not, from my research. And then subliminal is what happens underneath the tacit understandings we all have as experts in P&O. And those can vary. Some people will approach it. Some people have come up to the liminal space in a different way from others. Some people exit it in a different way. Threshold concepts. Let's go into a bit more detail about those. So there's this aspect of liminality, but what does a threshold concept actually look like? What does it need to have to become this transformative, this world-changing, view-changing idea? To be of any use, it has to be different from basic concepts, fundamental concepts, key concepts. We have those in P&O. We have them in the ISPO category guidelines. We have them for the USA has the ENCODE guidelines. The UK has Quality Assurance Agency National Health Guidelines. You know, we have them. We have them, other professions have them. These are things like the broad topic areas, the broad subject areas, and the individual topics under them. So it has to be different. Mayer and Land, the originators of the idea, said it has to have these 5 criteria. They didn't specify how many of those 5 criteria it has to have. They said there may be 5 criteria. And they used the examples of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as a transformative idea, and that it changes you. Once they've eaten that apple, they can't go back to having not eaten the apple. Jan Mayer also uses the example of roast potatoes. So you're sitting there as a potato with your skin on. At this point you could become a jacket potato, a boiled potato, mashed potato, chips, roast potato. Once the skin's been taken off, then, okay, we've limited, we're not being a jacket potato anymore, but we could still be another type of potato, and it goes on and on until, okay, you've been boiled partially, you're taken out, and then you're put into hot fat in the oven. You are going to be a roast potato. It transforms you. Does it transform just the amount of knowledge you have, what you know, or does it transform you as a person? Changes your beliefs, changes your view on the world. It needs to integrate. It might be integrated with other pieces of information, or it could be integrating into you and your belief system. Irreversibility. The idea is that that door shuts. You cannot go back. And that's the bit that makes it hard for us to explain certain things to students. It's troublesome. Perkins is troublesome knowledge. There's something difficult about it, possibly. And a professional concept is also bounded. It has some form of boundary. That boundary could be with another professional concept. It could be that this is how your profession views this particular concept. Another profession might view it differently, but there are some links. There is another model of professional concepts. It's the same idea, but they're describing it slightly differently. This is Davies and Mangan. They work a lot in economics. If you read the literature on professional concepts, you learn a lot about economics. And Davies and Mangan looked at using their students in economics and looked at, well, how else can we explain this? And they found that there was 3 different types of concept. These are not hierarchical. There's basic concepts, which are supporting ideas, and then there's procedural and disciplinary, which are on the same level. Procedural is the way of practicing in the discipline, and the disciplinary is the way of thinking in the discipline. So again, it's tied up with the profession that you're in. So those are the main ideas that I used. I'm not going to explain a huge amount about interpretive phenomenological analysis, because we don't have time. This is a qualitative research approach. Initially started in health psychology, but is expanding. And the idea is that your participants interpret the research, you also interpret what they say. And it's looking for people's experiences of a phenomenon. So I used this method. I interviewed students and staff using semi-structured interviews, and I also used questionnaires because some of the students were on placement across the UK, so were not able to come for an interview. I interviewed 18 students at 2 universities and 8 staff also at 2 universities. I limited the staff to staff who taught prosthetics. I had to limit because otherwise I would have had a huge quantity of data. I had a huge quantity anyway. And the students were from all 4 years of the course, from first year, so they completed first year, through to the very end of 4th year. What did I find? I found that there was 5 areas that were difficult for students to learn. They also mentioned that they found exams difficult. They didn't like problem-based learning. There was certain things that came through with things like that, but what I wanted to focus on was the conceptual difficulties. They had issues with numbers, calculations. Anything with an equation in was difficult for many, not all, but many students. Learning anatomy, physiology, pathology was also difficult for some students. How we walk. So we look at people's gait all the time. And so learning about that was also difficult for some students. Learning to talk was difficult. This is to do with learning the language of piano, but also learning to talk to patients and when to switch. And then considering the person, looking at not just the prosthesis or the orthosis, but considering the person as a whole. I'm going to give you some examples of what the students and staff said in a minute. What might cause these difficulties? The design of the curriculum, how you structure things, the students' previous experience, and tacit knowledge. Okay, so this was an example of an issue with the curriculum design from the trouble with the body. So this is to do with learning anatomy, physiology, pathology. And Marion described to me about learning embryology. She said that it was just trying to follow. She'd memorised it. She could do it from starting point to point 10. But if I asked her about a specific thing in the middle, if I asked, okay, when does limb formation happen? She wouldn't be able to tell me unless she went through all those 10 steps. Quite interestingly, there was a difference in which students found learning anatomy, physiology, and pathology difficult between the universities. The two universities had different methods, different learning and teaching approaches for these. The students at the other university didn't make comments like this. They made some other comments to do with anatomy, physiology, pathology, but not ones like this. Not ones about, okay, I don't know where this is going. Marion to me didn't understand why she was learning about embryology. So context is important. The students at the university had a problem-based learning approach. It was context-driven. They were given a little scenario, and they would have to go and find out about that scenario, the relevant anatomy, physiology, pathology. The students in the problem-based learning approach, interestingly, wanted lectures on anatomy. They wanted lectures. So curriculum design, we have to think about context. We have to think about where it is in the curriculum. Do they line up? Some of the students described to me they had spinal orthotics before they'd had spinal anatomy. So we need to have a whole curriculum approach. Think about, do that jigsaw puzzle. And think about, okay, we need to have all these aspects before we do this bit. Previous experience, the trouble with numbers had a big impact. The students may have to have a maths qualification, but some of them have had very bad experiences in maths in the past at school. And a number of them described shutters coming down and a complete blackout whenever they had to do anything that involved numbers or calculations. That's something we have to remember. These students are coming to us from different backgrounds. We want they have to be able to do some of this maths calculations. How do we get them through it? This is a staff member who described this. But again, students also described it. One student described in an exam, that shutter came down. She couldn't answer those questions in the exam. Students also described memorising how to do the calculation, the steps they had to do that calculation, rather than understanding it. They memorised it in order to pass the exam. Maybe there's an issue with the assessment. Previous experience can also be positive. If it's a positive previous experience, it can impact on, it allows them to focus on other things. So students who said they had had previous experience with communication, they may have had a job working in telesales or in a hotel dealing with customers. That ability to talk to people meant that they could relax on that aspect and they could focus on other aspects. So they weren't multitasking so much. Tacit knowledge, how they walk. This is an example from this concept. We have a lot of tacit knowledge, and when I'm talking about tacit knowledge in this context, I'm not just using it to explain things that we can't describe or are difficult to describe. I'm also using it to describe things that are invisible. They're hidden. It could be ground reaction force. Unless we have the gate lab and we see it on a computer screen, we can't see the ground reaction force. The students have to imagine it in their head. They have to have this picture. Also with underlying anatomy. Yes, you can prod, try and go in the anatomy, but you also have to have that image in your head of what it's supposed to look like, so that you know that that bony bit there is the fibular head, and how it differs from normal on occasions. It also has to do with memories. We all gain memories of patient experience, and we use these memories. We use them as shortcuts, and I'll have an example in a minute of this. So tacit understanding is things that are hard to explain, things that are invisible, but we need to be able to have this visual picture in our head, and memories. What does it look like when we cross the threshold? What makes a subject, what is a concept, a threshold concept, and when is it just difficult? What does it look like if it is a threshold concept? How do we tell whether somebody's got across that threshold? These are the things that were difficult, but I didn't decide. I decided that they were not threshold. They were not transformative. They didn't change the perspective of the student. And those were the trouble with numbers and the trouble with the body. So learning about the maths aspect, learning about the human body were not transformative. They were transformative in the sense that they changed knowledge, conceptual knowledge, but they didn't change that student. They didn't change the way they viewed the world, they viewed other things. If we look at it with the two different models, Merritt-Land's criteria model, no change in the way the person views the world. Didn't integrate with other aspects. They couldn't connect that calculation aspect with the visual ground reaction force, for example. So if it's something that's difficult, but it's not troublesome, there's a lack of change. Ontological is a change in your beliefs. No change in your beliefs, and there's a lack of integration with other subjects and with you. Under the concept model, these are probably basic concepts, rather than disciplinary concepts. There may be procedural concepts, so it may be that to understand in a calculation, you know that there are these steps that you have to do. But there's no associated memory with that procedure. You can memorize it, but you don't have a memory of doing it. Threshold, learning to talk, learning to walk, and considering the person. These all had a change in the way they viewed the subject. They changed the way the person believed things. They also integrated into the person. They integrated with other subjects. They could see the connections. They could. It became part of them. And in the concept model, we had procedural concepts with associated memories. So the students and staff described. They learned the procedure for gait analysis. They knew what they had to look for. But they had memories of looking at people's gaits, which enabled them to recognise things in other people's gaits. So the more they saw gait, the easier it became because they had these associated memories. And also particularly with patients. One of the questions I asked was a case study. I gave them a little scenario and said, okay, what are you going to prescribe for this person? What's your prosthetic prescription? I wasn't interested in what they were going to give the person. I was interested in why they were giving it. And many of them used memories with that. And these were things that were to do with the way we think as prosthetists and orthotists. Here's an example. This is an example of ontological transformations, which change the way the person views things. Suzanne describes going home and talking to her mum. And when she was talking with her mum, she realised, actually, I do know stuff about this. She could explain it. She could use the terms. Her mum was an OT. She could explain the terms and use the P&O terminology with her mum. Before that experience, she didn't think she understood it. She didn't think she'd learned anything. This is another example. She decided this is a procedural and disciplinary concept. So the way we view walking and the associated procedure with the gait analysis. Here's what from Tesco's. Tesco's is the big supermarket in the UK. The supermarkets in the UK, unlike the supermarkets in Norway, which are all different difficulty, have long straight aisles. The cashier sits at the end of an aisle with her till, and she can watch the people as they walk up and down the aisle with their trolleys getting their shopping. She was doing it all the time. This happens very early. This happens in year 1. Students change from not being aware of how people are walking to suddenly, actually, I'm watching people walk all the time. Something I think we can all say we all do. This is a procedural concept with associated memories. And this staff member, this is in response to the case study question. So I'd given them this case study and said, what are you going to prescribe? He told me. I said, why? Why are you giving that? And he said, you laughed at me. And he said, oh, we cheated. He didn't particularly look at exactly what was written for that case study. He thought, actually, I had a patient like this before. I can do what I did with that person. I can just use that. And so he took a shortcut. He didn't say, okay, this person, I can't think what he's on now. So he didn't go and say, okay, this person needs this type of foot because they need to walk a long distance on uneven ground, or they're jogging and therefore they need a foot that will enable them to do this. He said, he's like Fred, who I saw 2 years ago. I'll just use the same prescription. Students also did this. But it's much more limited with the students because they don't have the level of experience. So in this particular threshold concept, before they get to this point, what they did was they looked at what the concepts were, what were the advantages and disadvantages of a foot. And then they moved to thinking about the person. And then they moved to a more holistic view. But they still all used memories, whether it was a memory of a patient or a memory of a person they knew. One of the students described the person in the case study as being like their old gardener. And therefore what he would need. So, what's my take-home message? My take-home message is that these things were difficult for the students in the UK. Undergraduate level, students who have a wide variety of backgrounds, they may be different for your students. threshold concepts, maybe they're more similar. So some students at your courses might not have this issue with numbers, they might not have this issue with learning anatomy, physiology, pathology. Perhaps particularly if they've already done that at undergraduate level and they're now at postgraduate level. The threshold concepts then may be applicable to all of us. We need some more research in this area to enable us to find that out. There may be more. So the students in the two universities at the UK found calculations difficult. They found learning anatomy, physiology and pathology difficult. They also found learning about how we walk, how we talk, and looking at the whole person difficult. But those things changed them. They viewed the world in a different way. They viewed patients in a different way. They viewed walking in a different way. They viewed how we talk in a different way. What did I say? There's some places I use the idea of threshold concepts as their basis for curriculum design. They're looking at what are the threshold concepts in that discipline and using that as the formation for their curriculum design, rather than the key concepts, the basic concepts, the fundamental concepts. And they have this thing in Norway called a red thread. So these could be things that feed through the whole programme. How do we enable students to get through these concepts? What else do we need to think about? We need to think about the curriculum design. We need to make relevance explicit. The context has to be appropriate. If the students are, one of the things that's happening a lot, certainly in the UK, is that lots of students in the same class, shared learning. We have this in Norway for anatomy. All the students, the physio students, the OT students, the P&O students, all learn the same thing. We all need a slightly different context. We all need slightly different things emphasised. So if you're doing this multiple profession teaching, is you have to think about, okay, how do I make this relevant for each professional group? You also have to make sure that why they're learning this is clear to them. Why are you learning about embryology? And we also need to think about when in the curriculum are we placing supporting concepts. Don't have them after the P&O idea that you're talking about. Don't have spinal anatomy after spinal orthotics. The previous experience. Previous experience needs to be acknowledged. We need to do that need assessment that Deborah talked about. Different students have different backgrounds. Those experiences can be positive or negative. And we have to allow for working through those negative experiences as well, supporting students through them. The tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is the unwritten rules, the hidden, the visualizations, the need to be able to see ground reaction forces, have these images in our heads. Also the meaning behind the concepts. I didn't mention that. So for example, if it's, we all know what a PTP is. And you can say, yes, it's attentive bearing, but what does that actually mean? So the ideas behind the concept, not just, okay, this is what that is. And memories. Memories of patients, in particular. And also what I would like you to take away is the difference between troublesome knowledge and threshold concepts. Troublesome is things that are difficult, but don't change their students' belief, don't change the way they view the world. Threshold changes how they view the world.